Welcome back to the show. I'm here with Mark Drew from Command MD, a web development consultancy in London. He's the founder. That's a bit like George Washington founded the United States, except it's a little bit smaller.
Just a tad, but you'll soon be quite as, give me 400 years. And
there we go, yes.
And I'm sure we'll be quite as big as the United States.
Exactly. So we're going to be looking at getting graphical with GraphQL. And we'll look at the history of API use and where GraphQL fits into that, why you should use it, who's using it, what exactly it is, the fundamentals of it, some of the subtle language concepts and mutations that we can look at in there, and also how you'd use it from ColdFusion and how to get started on that. And we'll have a quick demo in the middle of the episode so you can see that.
And we shall praise the demo gods that everything goes well.
Always praise the demo gods. And we'll also check in on how CF Objective was and what's coming up at CF Camp for Mark. So welcome, Mark.
Well, thank you. Nice to see you again, I should say. Are these in order?
Yes. They probably are moderately in order. We do shuffle randomly sometimes, but yeah.
There should be enough time, because otherwise the audience is going to be like, but we have not seen him before. Yes. So thank you for having me on.
Yes, it's a pleasure having you here. That great British humor.
Well, or humor anyway.
Yes. So, if you're using APIs, people used to use SOAP and then they used REST, but now perhaps they're going to use GraphQL after going to your talk at CF Objective that was recent.
Or at least they can know there's a reason that they have another tool out there. This is why I do a lot of presentations. Is sometimes I don't know about a subject and I basically throw myself in there and say, "Hey, I want to go and talk about this subject I don't know much about." So it forces me to actually look into it to the point that I can describe it to somebody else. And once you've done that, you actually have to have gathered enough, knowledge about it that you're actually fairly good at it. And I think you keep on doing this.
Yeah, it's a great technique. I recommend it to our listeners. If you see some subject and you want to, maybe you don't want to go straight to a conference, but perhaps you can teach it to your coworkers,
right,
or a meetup.
Your coworkers, yeah. Exactly. I really suggest this is a very good technique. I mean, and it also allows you to it gives you a vantage point from which to learn a technology. So as you're learning it, you're saying, how would I describe this to somebody else? Which we don't normally do. We go like, how do I understand it? How would I do it? And then do it a few times. And once you explain it once or twice, you understand the holes in your knowledge, right? Which is a technique I've been using for years. I mean, this is why I talk at conferences and keep on thinking about them, because otherwise all you're doing is kind of preaching from the pulpit and reiterating things that you know already. Right, and that doesn't make us better human beings. That doesn't make us better, in our brains. So this is why I like looking at new technologies and talking at conferences about it.
I think that's genius. Helps you get younger every year.
Right. Yeah, and one day I'll be like, well, it helps you understand or realize how little you know. So when you're saying getting younger, but by the time, by now you realize how little you know because there's so much to know, right? But if you're always talking about one subject, you think you know it all, but you only know it all in that campus and you never get out of your comfort zone. So long story short, this is how I came on to looking at GraphQL. And actually I have to give a shout out to Adam Tuttle because he did suggest it to me on Twitter and say, why don't you talk about GraphQL? Have a look at that. Because for those who don't know, Adam Tuttle actually does Taffy, the REST library for CFML. So I've thrown it in there, which is not in the show notes, but we shall add it in there. But anyway, so he said to me, like, why don't you have a look how you would use it from CFML? Which kind of brings us on to like what GraphQL is, right? But before we can really talk about what GraphQL is, you have to understand like the procession. It's basically a way to query APIs, but why would you need yet another way to query APIs, right?
And APIs are just ways you access
interact.
Someone else's system.
Right, exactly. And we've all been using SOAP at one point or another. It was meant to be this great way to access stuff, but it turned out even more complicated, right? So for about the last decade, people have been using this other schema, which is called REST, which is what nearly every single API out there it does. It's great because it's HTML based, so HTTP based. You can put it behind SSL. You can put it behind, a caching server like Varnish or something like that, and it all works because you've got all this technology. It's like just using the existing technologies and passing JSON right back or forwards and back, right? And it's a great little system because it's got simple stuff, right? So you have like this representational state transfer. That's what REST stands for. But you basically create this whole idea of like an object, a person, and then you have an endpoint that's called like person, and then the next parameter, like the next folder path, would be their ID. So you do a get on a person with their ID equals 1, and you have these very kind of simplistic, unique URIs for every object in your system, right? Makes sense. Fantastic. And there's nothing wrong with that. You then use, let's say you do a put, which creates a new person. You do a post, which updates a person, and you do a delete method and it deletes a person. This is all fantastic stuff and very standard HTTP stuff that we're kind of used to. And this was great, fantastic stuff. But things kind of start breaking down a little bit. And we start missing things. Like, for example, one of the big problems is, have you ever looked at the Twitter API? So I always use the Twitter API because it's a nice API.
If I'm a little insomniac at night, I get that out.
And just have a little read.
Yeah. Immediately to sleep.
Right. But for a system that's meant to give you like 140 characters, well known that it just gives you 140 characters. If you actually look at if you go and fetch an individual tweet, brings you back, it's a huge amount of data. There's like all stuff about the user, there's stuff about the location of the tweet, there's stuff about who else was mentioned in the tweet, any attachments, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And if you start looking at it, it's like a massive JSON packet. And you can't say, well, as part of REST, you can't say, just give me a little bit of that, right? So it goes and gets lots of other stuff, right? And for example, if I want to get a tweet by you and it said, here are my friends, right, that are mentioned in this, and there might be links to them, I'd now have to go and do a whole bunch of other HTTP requests to get all those people, right? So for example, if I wanted to if you mentioned 5 people in a tweet and I wanted to get their pictures, I'd have to do one get request for your tweet. And then there's other 5 people mentioned, another 5 get requests to get a full user profile of that person, and then do some other HTTP requests to get actually the images, right? So that's what, off the top of my head, 11 get requests to get one tweet with all the people with all their images, right? Which is okay, but this kind of, why can't I just go and get all the URLs and then I have like 6 HTTP requests which include the images rather than 11, right? Much easier. And then you get that similar problem is like what you could then change your API to say you're going to go and get a tweet, but return the full objects of the people that are mentioned in it. So now you're mudding up the representation of your stuff. You're adding kind of filters to it, not even filters. You're doing like, or you do a different API, which is kind of like some kind of like prefixed queries. It's like, for example, get tweet with all the friends, or get tweets with all the mentions or something like that, right? Which is kind of bloating up your API, because you can imagine, as a programmer, I can imagine like 20 different versions of queries I'm going to want to do, right? Like get a tweet with all the likes and who's liked it. Like now you get like a very expanded documentation and of course we know how well developers are document stuff. So unless you've got a team, that documentation is never going to be written. I worked with an API recently that we couldn't get something to work that said it would work in the API, like it should work. And there was an attribute that they'd missed out that was in one of their blog posts. Thanks, developers. Yes. This is a big company, obviously. I should have read
pretty standard.
Yeah, exactly. And this was a good thing about SOAP because it was kind of self-describing, saying this is what I expect, this is what I give you. Very dryly though, but this is what we've lost in REST. Now that has gone somewhere. Of course, there are systems out there like Swagger that kind of generate your API, and you can generate your documentation out of that, out of your system. But you know, there's ways of doing it, but they're not comfortable ways of doing it, right? Then you get to the other part of the documentation is that you have to version it. That's why nearly every REST service starts with this like V1, right? Because now if you want to make any changes, now the whole point is that an API or software changes all the time, right? It should be inbuilt that you can change it, right? Now the problem is that, for example, if we wanted to get a tweet, and let's say Twitter did this and added categories to a tweet, right? But I guess they have with hashtags. But for example, if we're now going to have like an array of categories that a tweet is in, and I added that, that's fine because my existing clients that weren't using it, I've now just added that. They're not using that, but now they're getting that sent to them, but that's fine, right? That's fine. But what happens if I change the format of the date? Right. So for example, if I had like some, you know, just like localized date, and then I wanted to change it to UTC, now a whole bunch of clients are going to break. Right. And you have like two options, right? So you can either keep the old version like forever and support it till the sun burns out, because there's always going to be that one client that's going to be, you know, still using that version. Right? And again, as I said, documentation, like all of these changes never get updated in docs, right? Or they do eventually, and you know, but not as fast. And so these are like real issues with REST, you know. So out of that comes GraphQL. But so GraphQL actually came out of Facebook's problems with REST. So back in about 2012, I'm going to get the probably wrong, but I don't know if you remember that if you were using Facebook, they had a mobile app, or they'd built a mobile app that was basically like a web version in an app. Like they were using a web view in an app that they had like a cut down web version of it, and it was getting very slow. So they wanted to build a native version, and to build a native version, they had to build an API. So they started looking at SOAP, at REST, at various different APIs, as they would, because they have a couple of quid to spend on engineers to just go and have a look rather than implement. And they came up with GraphQL. So the whole point was to create a data query language that you could like query the trees. So you can imagine for Facebook, you want to get a person and you want to get all their friends, and you want to see their friends' friends, and be able to do those queries easily, right? They've been using it internally since about 2012, I'm guessing, which is when the mobile app was rewritten, and then they created an open source version back in 2015, and they've released it, and there's a spec for it, so it's an actual language, so you can implement it in other languages. So you don't have to, they made a reference implementation, but then you can actually build it in PHP or ColdFusion or whatever you want to build it in, right? So generally, what when you're building APIs, you have, and this is what their problem was that you're going to have like your system, right? So the gateway to your API that goes and talks to all your different database servers, or however you've structured your application, to your business logic. And in front of that, you'd have your API. But sometimes you'd go like, well, we're not going to be stupid like Twitter. We're going to have a mobile version of the Twitter client that gives you like streamlined stuff. But then you go, okay, we also have a desktop version, which doesn't give you like this cut down version. So now you have two APIs that you're modifying. The whole idea is that you have GraphQL that replaces those two, or you work alongside with those two, that queries all your services, and you can just send in a query, go and get me a tweet with, just give me the text and maybe get all the images of the people that come back, and it'll go and return it. So the client-defined queries.
So really, it's pretty similar to how we use SQL to query a database. in
Right.
modern terms, as
Yeah.
opposed to the way before SQL database was invented, people had flat files and they did all kinds of gymnastics to try and get to their data. And this is the same kind of evolution from REST to GraphQL.
Right, because it's got a couple of things in there which help, but like SQL, it has this ability to jump and have connections and have edges and nodes on those edges. So in other words, it's able to jump the object that you are looking at and say, okay, so this is connected to something else. Let's have a look at that, right? So the whole idea of GraphQL is hierarchical. So you can do a query at the top, and then I can go and see the children of that, and then go into the children and do like a hierarchy of data queries. And when I return that back, I can get a hierarchical structure back, right? Like a tree of data back. The other idea about it is product-centric, which I guess a little bit SQL is a little bit. In other words, all the nouns that you're using are nouns of your system. So I'd have a tweet, I'd have a person, I'd have a, I don't know, spaceship, I'd have a car, or those are the nouns that I'm using in my system. Those will be used in the language. It's also got this idea of strong typing, so it knows what the variables that are going in are and the variables that are coming out are. So you could create your own variables. So you can have objects, go and get me a person, and that's an object, and that's kind of a variable that you could possibly pass around, right? And you can also let the client specify the queries. Rather than saying, here's where the URL endpoint, because you have a GraphQL endpoint, you can also say like, well, the client's specifying what they're asking for and sending it over. It's also introspective. So part of the spec is that it will return information about itself. Right? So you can say, you can ask me about these things. And this is a part of where the documentation comes out of it, because these things have these properties and they're of these types, and I'll return this, and this is what you should ask me, right? Because then you can, compound them and put them together.
So no more reading weird blogs about the API to find out what's currently in there. You can just introspect it.
You just like see it in there going, oh, right, okay, so that's what it's going to give me, right? I should show you a little demo maybe, because now that we've talked all about it, I can give you a little.
Yes, let's have a quick look at some code here.
Okay, so
for those listening on audio, we'll try and narrow
it's going to be
It's like watching cricket on the radio, right?
Yeah. So Mars coming up to bowl here. You've just used a language that probably 90% of your listeners don't have any idea.
Well, watching baseball on the radio, but they probably wouldn't identify. I don't know who does that anymore either. That used to be a big thing.
Yeah. But now it's podcast, right? It's like watching podcasts on the radio.
Yes.
What? No, I don't know. But for example, there's a great website. I don't know if you've ever seen this, which is called Swappy, which is the Star Wars API, which allows you to get
critical.
It's critical, right? Which allows you to get.
Everyone should be using this, right?
Yeah, I think that Raymond Cannon told me that the guy's going to stop supporting this, and if he is, I think someone should take it on because it's fantastic.
But it's basically a little playground where you can try out an API that isn't going to cause tweets to get emitted or
right,
whatever.
Exactly. So, for example, you can do like as part of the API, you can go to /people/1, and what you get is a nice JSON structure, which is of Luke Skywalker, because with his name, his height, his mass. I guess you need to know his mass about if he's going to be slammed into a wall or something like that. But also you get like things which are quite important here is that in a proper REST API, you'd have a home world. And because that's a link to another object in the system, has actually got a link to the URI of that object, right? So for example, the home world is planets number 1, which is Tatooine, right? You also have, for example, an array of relationships. So you can say, which films has he been in? And then you get a nice array of films that Skywalker's been in, right? And they have updated it. Last time I looked, they hadn't updated it. And you can say which species, and you see that these are very big links and a date that this record was created and edited, and it's its own URL. So this is just to give you an idea of what kind of data is stored in the Star Wars API, because we also have a GraphQL connection to that API. It's called the GraphQL swappy. Let me just, shall I share this?
Yes, let's have a quick peek at what that looks like.
So here we go. So this is what GraphQL. Let's go and get a person. So you have curly brackets. The interesting thing about GraphQL, which throws people at first, is that it looks like JSON, but it's not JSON, right? So you don't need to put all the double quotes. They've tried to trim out all the stuff that you really don't need to be putting in there. So I can say, I can press Control Space, and it tells me all the things that are available in there. And these endpoints allow me to search just the schema. So if I want to search for a person, it tells me that a person has got a name, a birth year, eye color. This is what is self-descripting, right?
Don't forget the mass.
The mass, exactly, it has got mass. Where's the mass? There you go. Mass tells me it's type of float, right?
Yeah.
And the home world that is actually linked to a planet, and I can see what's in a planet, right? Now this is actually an API, the API returning a call into a nice UI. So let's actually do some searching for those people that are watching at home, and if not, you're gonna have to watch this on YouTube. So if I now put person, and I can see person ID is equal to 1, right? Now this is a hierarchical bit, because now if I try to run that, it said, well, you didn't ask for anything to come back, right?
This is one of the good things about GraphQL. You actually get error messages back,
right.
whereas
so
when you're doing REST stuff, sometimes it's a little cryptical as to why it didn't work.
Right, you either get a 500 error, a 404 error, all the HTTP codes, and you have Wikipedia on the other screen to find out what 407 actually means. I don't know, can't remember what 407 means. But for example, now I can put name, and I can put comma, and let's get mass.
Critical,
right?
yeah.
And the data that comes back is a struct. I actually get JSON data back, which is nicely that GraphQL queries don't have to be in JSON, but you get JSON back. So you get, here's some data, you get a person, Luke Skywalker, mass of 77. That's fantastic, but let's say I want to find out what the name of the planet that he was at was, right? So now remember in how I showed you what his home world was, just a link to another object.
Yet another REST call, yeah.
Right. So now I can go, well, give me the home world, and I'm going to get like
the great thing there is you didn't have to know what the parameter name was. It's all coming from the introspection.
Exactly. So there we go. We have home world Tatooine, and I can see what else it has. It has a diameter, the number of standard hours. So this is rotation period, orbital period, the gravity, the population, which I think is fairly low, isn't it? And I can see what else. What else is in there, so I can see a whole bunch of different things that are related, and I can just literally call that, and I get data being returned, which is a person with a mass of 77, a home world equals Tatooine, and a population of 200,000, quite big.
That was a lot quicker than doing it using REST.
Right, because you would have had to do one call to go and get Luke, trim out all the stuff, or ignore all the stuff that was actually returned, because this data packet is literally what the server returned back to you. And if in your application that's all you need, it's great, because unless ask your IT manager, maybe all of us listening to this are developers, but ask your IT manager how much your API is costing in like traffic. If you're having to pay for traffic for a very popular site, maybe like cutting it down to like 1% might be like quite good. Quite a good thing.
And then if the API changes in the future, do you have to change the GraphQL query, or? You
would have to change the query, but at least the errors that you're getting are not held in a third-party documentation system, right? The error that you'd start getting in your systems because you're using it are going to be like, I don't know, name is not as you saw there. Name is required or something like that, right? Now, the other part about this is that it can reach out to arrays of stuff. So, for example, let's say film connections. In other words, which films he was in, right? Is going to the edges of the query. So you can call an edge, and for each edge, right? So for each edge, we have a node. So these are basically, this is a relationship to other queries, right?
Mm-hmm.
So for each node in that edge, I can now look at what the title of the film was. So we can now hit that, and I get film connection. Here's all the edges, and here's all the nodes. And for each node, I have a title for it, right? This is what they call the relationship to an array of other stuff. So Luke has one home world, so that's a one-to-one relationship. But if I have a one-to-many relationship, those are called edges, and in each edge you have a node, right? So I can do I can do things like the title or opening crawl. That's quite interesting. And let's say the director, right? So I can get all that data just that I wouldn't have known was there much easier, just all in one hit, right? So now you can imagine I was doing an API. So, Luke Skywalker, who's quite skinny, from the homeworld of Tatooine, that appeared in A New Hope and all of these things, right? And I've now done one hit to do that. And most of the films are directed by George Lucas. Well, they weren't, but a couple of the films were directed by George Lucas, right?
It's genius.
It's genius, and it's that easy, right? Now, of course, even in your application, you might have...
And can you put, like in SQL, you could say, bring me back everyone who has mass less than 80.
You can do that kind of thing. That would be up to your application, and it's not up to GraphQL to do that. And how you do that is by passing variables, right? And it'll be up to your query to do that, right? I think they're working, and I haven't quite got to this part, on this idea of filters, that you can pass in a filter as part of the arguments, because here's the film connection that you could probably pass in first, before, last, right? These are the only filters that film connection has. The film connection query in the back end of this. But you could see that you could say, mass equals something, right?
Right.
Less than. You'd have to implement that, right? Because it's not quite a query language like SQL that everyone knows how the engine is meant to respond. This is a query language for your service layer, right? So it's up to you to implement it. But if we look at, for example, I know the edges is always what throws someone, but the nice thing about film connection, I can do something like page info or total count or films, right? So I can run that. I don't know if that's going to say, right, needed expected name. So I can do film connection films. So you get the same thing here. Oh, expected name. Oh, I think this is, I have to put a variable in there. Sorry. But the whole point about the connection is that you can also get metadata about it. So you can get page info, which needs to be has next page, end cursor, etc. Or you can get total count. Expected name, not found. Oh, there we go.
The best way to think about edges is if you had if you were looking at a drawing of a tree, maybe a child's drawing where the trunk came out and then it split into branches, and those branches had sub branches.
Right.
So an edge is like a branch, and a node is where the branch ends.
Right.
Yeah.
And like even for each one of those, you can keep on going down. So for example, let's do films. Let's do that. So I've got the films. I could do title. Let's see producers. So each film can have producers, and it returns an array. Because those are not massive objects in our system. They're just things. But we could have, each film could have, for example, a species connection or a starship connection or a character connection. So you can get a list of characters that are in each film that Luke Skywalker has also been in.
Right, and you can see the tree nature of this, because some of the movies have 2 producers, some have 3, probably some have 1.
Right.
and then in your code, you can pass through this stuff as you want to.
Exactly. So, I mean, that's the essential concept of it. So you can actually pass variables. So this would be on your client. This is how you would implement it in your mobile app, if you're building a React app and using this as a query language into your API. Obviously, what you don't want to be doing, which you kind of have to in SQL, well, you don't have to totally in SQL, is doing this replacement, right? So I can do something like ID. So hold on a second. Well, you can actually do, you'd be passing in the string there, but you can also define which variables you're going to pass in there. So you can say that this is a query, right? So, and you can have person ID. I can't remember the syntax off the top of my head, but it's something like this. So this is my query of, oh, sorry, the query get Luke, sorry, this is getting a person and getting all the film connections, get person and films. And we could pass in a person ID. I'm not doing the best example because I'm just doing this off the top of my head, which is, and then you could pass it here as a variable. I've got the syntax wrong, so everyone at home is screaming at me. This is a problem with live coding, even on podcasts. So I can do person ID equals 1, and you could pass it like that, right?
Right. So you can pass in a variable to in your code to the GraphQL query.
Right. Syntax.
I know some of the other things you mentioned earlier were fragments.
Right. Fragments is this whole idea that you can actually replace some code in there. So for example, if we had various queries that we were using and we were getting a normal thing, which is, let's delete this. So for example, we're always getting name and, I don't know, is there an age? Name and birth.
These characters are ageless.
Yes. Let's simplify this a little bit. So let's say we're always getting, remove too many brackets. So if we're getting,
if you weren't good with curly brackets before you started writing GraphQL, you will be a curly bracket genius by the time you finish.
Exactly. So if we're always getting name and birth here for different queries, we could fragmentize that. In other words, is creating it as an include. So what you can do is fragment. We're going to call it person info. Maybe, I don't know. On person, right? Because it means that this fragment only works on a person. Okay. And then we can say it's that. And you can say his name and birth year, right? So it already knows what we're trying to do. And I can then put there like, do like 3 dots, and I can do person info. Hopefully this will work in this client, but this is essentially what it is. Right, so it's now getting the same thing. It's basically including
this is sort of like a stored procedure in SQL.
Stored procedure. I mean, this would be on the client. So basically, what you're doing is doing like includes of a
code fragment.
Of a code fragment.
Okay.
Right.
So it's
because
like
it could be much
include.
more complex, right? So it could be, for example, his name, and it's also home world. And it's an inbuilt way to do something that you might be doing in the host language. So, for example, if you're calling this from, I don't know, whatever JavaScript client you're using for your client, GraphQL is saying like, look, you can just put in GraphQL statements and includes and stuff like that, and it's all fine. The same thing with arguments, right? So, for example, we've got fragments. We can pass variables, which I said, which let's say this is, let's do that again, just see if we can do it properly. Person.
And we'll put the URL to this example in the show notes. So if you want to try it out at home.
Let's say do person by ID, $ ID equals ID. This the other good thing is that this client that I'm using is not something on my machine. It's something on the web that anyone can actually use, right?
Cool.
So now that we've got this, we can actually pass into this function, so to speak. We can pass in a variable, let's say 4. And now if we run that, expected name not found. Oh, right. What have I got missing? Query, person, name.
I think we didn't pray to the demo gods quite enough.
We didn't.
Before,
no, let's just see
this.
if we can go name.
But maybe you can tell us about mutations in GraphQL.
One more thing, please. There we go.
Yes.
It's never used. Fine, I won't use it. There we go. Right. Too many curly brackets. Exactly. Yes. So the whole idea is that you can actually pass variables to your query like you would do query parameters or something like that. But it's actually built in to say this is a query language, right? So the thing about mutations is this whole idea that, well, you want to, let's say, I can't do it with this API because it's just a read-only API, but you want to change your data, right? So you want to mutate your data, whether you want to add some stuff. Mutations are basically like a long word for CRUD operations, or creating and updating stuff, right? So mutations, I'm going to see if they have any. I doubt it. Mutation. And what you can do is create a mutation that says, I want you to, there's no mutations. I would have got like a list, but let's say create tweet. So when I'm creating a tweet, I would want to say that I'm going to add an ID of whatever. I want to put a text of hello, and I can do something like that, right? So that's basically a function. I'm passing a function with some variables in it saying, I want you to update with this. The interesting thing about the mutations with GraphQL is that you can also define, once you've created something, what you want to return, right? So for example, like we do this all the time. We do a create in SQL, and then we spend an hour looking for the query to go and get the last inserted item, right? Do you know what I mean? It's like we're always doing this. I'm part of GraphQL. It's literally, if I go and do a create a tweet, I can't demo it here because this is not the right API. But if I send a mutation of creating a tweet, I could also pass the variables, but also say what I want you to return back. So I could return the ID and the text again. So once you've done that function, you'd get a return, and it could be the text, the resultant, anything else. But it's already like inbuilt to say, if I've created this object, if I've mutated this object, I will return you some data straight back. And that's essentially mutations.
Fabulous. So if you want to use this in ColdFusion, is it hard, easy, medium?
Well, I found two things. It's creating your own GraphQL server is a little bit harder because normally we go down to Java for a lot of the clever stuff, right? But if you wanted to access GraphQL services, it's pretty easy. It's just HTTP, right? So you might need to get tokens. You might need to do those kind of things, but which are with any API, right? You have like header tokens and stuff like that. But essentially what you're sending over are the queries. The gotchas are that you have to remove a lot of the double spacing. So as you saw in this example, I've got like lots of tabs and things like that you'd probably write. You have to strip all of that out before you send it, right? That's the main gotcha that I found. But it did tell me, it was like, this is not in the right format. I don't know what you're talking about. But that's not the greatest thing to do when you're first testing an API. So that was the only gotcha I really got. The rest kind of works the same. You, for example, send a JSON string which has got your queries, and you send with a query which is your query, and the other key would be your variables, which is another JSON within JSON of your variables, right? And that's it. And then you get, JSON back, which you just deal as you standardly deal with stuff, Some APIs use a get and some use a
So it
post.
seems a little ironic that GraphQL is designed to make other APIs easy to use, but you're calling it as a standard API.
Well, I'm just calling it as a standard HTTP, right? Okay,
it's not a REST call then.
It's not a REST call per se. It's a HTTP call.
Okay.
Is it REST? I can't remember. I don't think I pass any headers in there. You don't pass any headers saying that you want it to be a certain format because it returns it.
And are there any libraries that help with using this, or?
At the moment, none for there's tons of libraries, but not specifically for CFML. I can see you building one very easily. Probably by the time that I finish, if Matt Gifford is listening to this podcast, by the time that we're doing this, he's already written one. I know him. He'll probably build one that quickly. But there are a lot of server-side libraries for other languages like Node and JS and Scala and PHP, etc. that are built in there. What's interesting is that there's a Java version that I've been investigating, and you can do it in two ways. You can implement it manually in Java, in other words, saying each node and describing each node and describing your API in essence. Or you can use something called IDL, which is a domain-specific language for defining the spec. So this whole schema can actually be defined as a language that then you pass into the Java and it generates all the stubs for it. So the problem would be then writing that and anytime there's a query, being able to tie it to your query, to your business object. So that's the bridge that I haven't crossed yet, but stay tuned. I'll probably come up with solutions for that by maybe October. We shall see.
Coming up real soon now.
Yeah, anytime right now.
So who's using GraphQL? Does anyone use this?
Well, obviously Facebook.
Anyone we might have heard of? Facebook, yeah, I think I've heard of them.
Yeah, but I mean, so like Facebook's interesting, and I don't know how many people are doing a lot of Facebook integration, right? I think even Twitter using a little bit. I haven't found the endpoint yet. I haven't been really looking. But the one that I was looking and was very interesting for me was GitHub. So I think most people use GitHub, or if they don't, they should do. But it's good to manage your repos and stuff like that. You can actually look at your own repositories, look at various repositories and hit their API. And I think they're deprecating their REST API in favor of a GraphQL API. Right, so they're going like, oh, check out our old REST API, but if you really want to use our stuff, it's going to be the GraphQL one. And I think that makes a lot of sense because there's fairly little processing they have to do on the server side already, because it already ties into all of their systems.
And some other ones people might recognize: Intuit, who do bookkeeping software; Pinterest,
Shopify, I think, which is
Shopify, Sky TV.
Which anyone in Europe would recognize.
Yeah.
And the whole idea is that you're using less resources over the internet,
and using less of your mental brain power because you didn't have to figure out the API's documentation and
for each individual object in your system, right? So, like for example, like even so, the mental exercise that we could have had for trying to get all the different parts of that Star Wars API. Like, are we talking about ships? Are we talking about starships? Are we talking about planets or systems? I don't know, right? It's like, I'd have to go and look at what the thing was. But even in our exploration just now, we just went by and started like just exploring it without having to know the documentation for that and going, which fields are they? What are they called? It's already in there because you can explore all of that and then get that query and paste it into your system. That's what makes it a lot faster than something else. I use a bit of software called Paw, like dog's paw, which is used to interact with REST services. It's a great bit of software. I'm not getting a hit, not getting a paid back from them. But, it's, even though it's a great bit of software, it does a lot of stuff. it doesn't help me with finding out what's there, right?
Mm-hmm.
It helps me do it when I have to do it, but it doesn't help me find out what's there when you're there. And I really
Yeah.
wish I did a lot of work with different payment providers. I hit a lot of REST services recently as part of various projects. And oh my God, if they would just done GraphQL, even not knowing the processes, it will tell you these are the functions you can call, right? These are the mutators to our system, create payment, create this, create that.
Mm-hmm.
And we require these fields because it's already self-defined. I don't have to be reading crappy, payment provider documentation, and they really don't know how to do documentation. For example,
they know how to charge a percentage. That's what
they
they're
know how to
skillful
do
at.
that, right? But I mean, Jesus, one of them had I don't know how many people have come across this, but you would expect, maybe because we're from a ColdFusion background, a structure has keys, but the sort order of them is kind of pretty random, right? Especially if you add them, unless you specifically say they're in a certain order. And this payment provider needed the keys in a JSON request to be in a certain order.
Yeah.
Right. So it's like, great,
Genius.
thank you. Genius. I mean, that's not even the part of the spec of JSON, right? JSON can be in whatever order. Because you could put it alphabetically, you could do it whatever you like, right. but it was failing with a expressive error, which makes me lose more of my hair.
We were doing this project connecting to this SAML server recently, and they had like really wacky things that they didn't document, but things had to be in a certain order, and then sometimes it didn't matter what the case was, and sometimes it did matter, and
oh God,
all kinds of, and sometimes the white space was ignored, and sometimes you absolutely had to have just the right kind of white space.
And this is a problem. They don't document that stuff. You only find it out through testing. And when are you testing? You're testing hitting their system. And
and then they don't give you error messages back.
Right. Or they might not give you a test account. So your test is actually you actually running whatever.
Or they're in a time zone on the opposite side of the world. So you send us some test requests and you don't hear back if they worked until the next day.
Right. So that slows things down a tad, a smidgen.
Yeah.
And those are the pain points that GraphQL are meant to ease, or at least get in the way. It's not everything, but it doesn't do everything. Funnily enough, I've just got a spider right in there. Let's see if we can put him in front of the camera. There you go.
Is it a big spider?
No, we're in England. It's a tiny spider.
Oh,
we're not in Peru where you'll have...
Could be an enormous spider. Could be the size of the NASCAR line spider. So is GraphQL faster to run as well, or
faster to run
than doing a bunch of REST calls? Or?
Yeah, it would be, because you've got that network stuff out of the way. It doesn't kind of sit in front of your APIs, or it could, but it sits in front of your business layer, right? So you'd create the business objects to there. Now, the queries on the back end, GraphQL is not going to help you with. But if you were doing the same things, if you added up like the query times to service 15 requests versus the query time to service 1 request, and then you say like, well, how much to return 1 megabyte of JSON back versus returning 100 kilobytes of stuff for GraphQL, I think you'd find the benefits there, right? If your API is pretty lean anyway, if you're returning true false variables back, it might not be the best way, but it might be a good way to hit your system, to query your system.
And I know you mentioned an Apollo server somewhere earlier. What exactly does that mean?
Right. So there's Apollo's a whole bunch of different tools. So there's a community of open source tools for working with GraphQL. So for example, they've got an iOS client, they've got an Android client, they've got a client for React, and it's their own client called Apollo client. And it's also a server, which is for essentially for most of the Node server-side frameworks like Express, Connect, Happy, and Co, and various different things that allows you to create your own GraphQL interface to your systems, which are great little tools that you can have a look for that.
Cool.
I think the
So,
last thing. Oh,
yeah,
sorry.
anything else on GraphQL? I guess we should give people why we called this episode Let's Get Graphical.
Well, do you want me to sing that?
Yeah, sing it. Channel your inner Olivia
Yeah.
Newton-John.
Well, we had to get graphical.
Oh,
Graphical.
graphical.
We're
Let's
gonna
get
get
graphical.
graphical. There you go.
Graphical. Yeah.
Yeah. A query.
Only here on CF Alive can you see Mark Drew
Dancing.
channel Olivia Newton-John while coding in ColdFusion.
Next episode, I should be wearing those leotards.
We'll have a parental advisory on that episode.
The screen will go all blurry.
So anything else on GraphQL before we switch to a related topic?
Yeah, there's the last one is a project that I saw called graph.cool, which is a backend. So if you're already wanting to use Graph, like you're trying to build a mobile app that you want to store some data and you don't really build the backend because you want to build the actual data, you could actually have a GraphQL backend for mobile and web developers already. So you can just go in there and define your objects and they'll store it all for you and provide an interface for you. So that's a really interesting little project there.
Cool.
And that's it. That's me for GraphQL.
And you're going to be, you spoke about this at CF Objective. Are you talking about it anywhere else this year, or?
That's a great segue, Michael. I'll be talking at CF Camp in October and NC DevCon about this.
Excellent.
I think these are the talks I got accepted. So
fabulous.
Yeah, so it should be good fun. It's nice to travel out to North Carolina, Raleigh, North Carolina, and then Munich. And I think it's in the same place. I need to check. In CF Camp's a great little conference because it's in Munich, but it's also in the Munich airport. So you can literally fly in, go to the conference, and then like fly out when it's finished.
Wow.
A couple of days later. Of course, you might have to find a hotel for the night in between, but it's...
No, just sleep in the airport.
Just sleep in the airport. It's a great airport, and there's the bar which literally down there. So it's actually great because you don't have to... This is the problem with a lot of conferences, like especially the one in CF Objective I just went to, which was in Washington, D.C., which is you fly into Dulles, and you've got like this hour to get from Dulles to D.C. where the conference is. I mean, you know this because
it's a big city, D.C.
It's a big city, right? And for some reason, each time I hit traffic, and I think there's just traffic. I don't think it's a time of day thing.
Well, one day they'll have a metro link all the way to Dulles. In fact, maybe they have that already. Yeah, they're building it. They've been building it for at least 10 years. So.
They're getting there because I think we're driving back from the airport and I could see all this building work, and then it actually was had a train. But as you know, if you fly to conferences a lot, it's those travel bits that really knacker you out. Because you come out of the plane, do all your thing, and then you have to like do this whole bunch of traveling, and you do your conference.
The nice thing about CF Summit in Las Vegas is the Las Vegas airport's right slap bang in the middle of Las Vegas. So.
Right. So you got like a 10-minute drive or something like that.
Yeah, just get in an Uber and there you go.
Right.
I guess they're a bit more laissez-faire in Nevada about where they put the airport.
Well, they had a choice. They had a big flat desert to put it in.
That's true too. Yes, it was pretty empty before they started putting casinos there.
Right. So and they said like, well, we need an airport, make it really close, and we'll build it there. But last time I went to Las Vegas was a very long time ago. I don't think the town went out all the way to McCarran. I think it's...
Oh, no, it's gone all the way around it by now.
Yeah, Las Vegas has been the fastest growing US city for decades, hasn't it?
I don't know the exact statistics on that, but it certainly has grown a lot. And there's more to Las Vegas than just the casinos, because I have a friend who bought a condo there because it was a cheap deal, and he bought it because you get cheap flights from there to all over the US. So it's pretty central. Yeah, because I have a suspicion the casinos subsidize the pricing flights
of anything. Yeah.
But I was talking with Alicia from Adobe about CF Summit, and she was telling me all the exciting things happening there. And apparently
that's going to be interesting.
Yeah, it's all going to be at the Mirage this year. Apparently,
it's also at the moment, and tell me if I'm wrong, isn't it the Adobe Developer Week?
Right now, it's
right
happening
now.
right this moment. Yes,
It started yesterday. I got my notification
Yes.
yesterday, so I jumped in
Yes.
on a webinar there.
We've been tweeting about it.
How have you? What's this Twitter thing you keep on going on about? I must join.
Yes.
No, I am on the Twitters, but yeah. So that's a good. When's Summit? CF Summit.
5th November 15, 16, is it? Or
Okay,
mid-November
November
for sure.
And that's going to be
Yeah,
quite
just
warm,
before Thanksgiving. For those of us who celebrate, yes.
Right. A random Thursday in the month.
Actually, I think it's Thursday the 16th, Friday the 17th, but I think there might be an optional thing on the 15th. I'm a little...
Okay.
I'm trying to remember if they had an optional day the day before. I'm sure someone, maybe Otis or someone else, is doing some training.
Right, they're very clever with Otis. I mean, they were like awesome at CF Objective. They run their training the days before.
Mm-hmm.
They also run some sessions during it, as well as all of that.
Yeah,
they're a machine. I mean,
yes, they are. And I think there's some training the day before CF Camp as well.
I would not be surprised. I mean, to be honest with you, that's genius, because it makes as a presenter at conferences or as a sponsor, you, even if it doesn't make all the money back or anything like that, at least it's chipped off the edge. You know, takes the edge off all the flights and stuff like that, and the time that you take off to do these things. You know.
Yeah. No, definitely. Well, and it gets the word out. I know Preside is doing a training the day before.
Right.
And they definitely are not doing it for the money, because they're only charging like $5 or something.
Right, but it's really worth it for them, right?
Yeah, because they want to get more people using their CMS. So, you know, I mean,
yeah, get people
unless you're buddies with a puffin, which is their logo, you know, you may not even have heard of Preside. So this is a chance to get the word out and get more people using it. It's an open source CMS, so it's not like the thing costs any money.
Right.
But, you know.
But it's getting the word out.
Yeah.
And that's the whole point.
Yeah. Well, thanks for telling us all about GraphQL today and giving us your Olivia Newton-John impression there.
I hope those are not the only takeaways, but yeah.
No, I think the takeaway was, for me, that it makes using APIs a lot easier and faster, both for development and for when you run the code. So,
well, you're most welcome. Like being on the show. And
yes.
Now that you're on YouTube, you have to like and subscribe. Well, which
yes, like and subscribe, please. And actually, what the usual thing I ask is, please leave a review on iTunes, because the reason is, the more reviews we get, the more, when people search for stuff, apparently they throw things up in their search results higher.
Right.
When you have more reviews. So when
I'll have to do that for my podcast.
People are searching for ColdFusion or GraphQL. Yes.
Yes, that'll come up, right? Awesome.
Yeah.
And CFML. So like, you love the CFML / ColdFusion GraphQL.
Exactly.
Right. We should just put a screen of like this, just write this into the review, I guess.
Maybe we can do that. I try and keep the editing on these things simple. Anyway, thanks for joining us from London today.
My pleasure, Michael.
Beautiful, sunny summer day there.
Yeah. Let's say that it is.